Picture this. You're a young woman in 16th century Istanbul, barely 18 years old, and you've just been selected for one of the most coveted yet terrifying positions in the Ottoman Empire. You're not going to be a concubine or a servant in the traditional sense. Instead, you're about to become something far more precious and far more trapped. A wet nurse in the imperial harem, responsible for feeding the future rulers of an empire that spans 3 continents. Your breasts have just begun producing milk after giving birth to your own child, a baby you'll never see again because the Sultan's offspring must come first. As you're led through the marble corridors of Topkapı Palace, past fountains that whisper secrets and windows draped in silk that cost more than your village could earn in a lifetime, you realize that your body is no longer your own. You've become a living vessel, a human dairy farm for the most powerful dynasty on earth. The eunuch guiding you speaks in hushed tones about the sacred duty you're about to undertake. But what he doesn't tell you, what no one tells you, is the dark reality behind the golden bars of the imperial nursery. The Ottoman system of royal childcare wasn't just elaborate. It was a carefully orchestrated machine of control, manipulation, and psychological warfare that would make your life a living paradox of privilege and imprisonment. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to discover isn't the sanitized version of Ottoman royal life that most history books present. This is the raw, uncomfortable truth about how the empire's most precious assets, its future rulers, were raised in an environment so controlled and artificial that it bordered on the surreal. The story of royal breastfeeding in the Ottoman harem reveals layers of human drama, scientific ignorance, and social engineering that will fundamentally change how you think about power, motherhood, and the price of empire. The selection process for imperial wet nurses began long before you ever set foot in the palace. Ottoman officials maintained networks of informants throughout the empire, constantly searching for women who met their exacting criteria. You couldn't just be any nursing mother, you had to be young, preferably between 16 and 25. You had to be beautiful, because even wet nurses in the Ottoman court were expected to be pleasing to look upon. Most importantly, you had to be healthy, with clear skin, bright eyes, and abundant milk production. But here's where it gets disturbing. You also had to be disposable. The ideal wet nurse candidate was a woman whose disappearance wouldn't destabilize local communities or create political problems. Orphans were perfect. Widows with no extended family were ideal. Women from conquered territories who had no powerful relatives to ask questions about their fate were particularly prized. The medical examination you underwent before acceptance was unlike anything you could have imagined. Palace physicians didn't just check your general health, they conducted intimate evaluations that would be considered assault by modern standards. They examined your breasts for size, shape, and milk quality. They tested your milk by taste, consistency, and color. They even analyzed it for what they believed were signs of moral character, convinced that a woman's virtue could be detected in her breast milk. These examinations took place in chambers specifically designed for the purpose, with elaborate furniture that positioned women for optimal inspection. The physicians, all male despite the intimate nature of their work, approached these evaluations with the clinical detachment of livestock inspectors. You were poked, prodded, measured, and evaluated not as a human being, but as a biological resource to be optimized for imperial use. The theoretical foundation for Ottoman wet nurse selection was a bizarre mixture of Islamic theology, Greek medical theory, and folk superstition that had been codified over centuries of imperial practice. Palace scholars genuinely believed that a wet nurse's character, intelligence, and moral qualities would be transmitted to the infant through her milk. This meant that the selection process wasn't just about finding women who could produce milk. It was about finding women whose essential nature was deemed worthy of shaping future sultans. The racial and ethnic dimensions of this selection process reveal the complex hierarchies that governed Ottoman society. While the empire was remarkably diverse, certain ethnic groups were considered more suitable for nursing royal children. Greek women were prized for their supposed beauty and intelligence. Circassian women were valued for their fair complexions and refined features. Women from the Balkans were sought after for their perceived strength and vitality. This ethnic preference system created a bizarre form of human trafficking, where women were essentially bred and selected for their potential as imperial wet nurses. Families in certain regions would actually prepare their daughters for this possibility, seeing it as a path to social elevation despite the personal cost. Young girls would be trained in proper deportment, taught basic palace etiquette, and even given special diets designed to optimize their future milk production. Once selected, your transformation from ordinary woman to imperial wet nurse began immediately. You were given new clothes, not the elaborate silks you might expect, but specially designed garments that prioritized functionality over beauty. These outfits included innovative undergarments that provided support and easy access for nursing, along with outer robes that marked your status within the complex hierarchy of the harem. Your living quarters were luxurious by the standards of ordinary Ottoman subjects, but they were also designed as sophisticated prisons. The rooms assigned to wet nurses were located in a specific section of the harem, close enough to the imperial nursery for quick access, but isolated enough to prevent unsupervised contact with other palace inhabitants. These chambers featured beautiful tilework, comfortable furnishings, and windows that offered glimpses of palace gardens. But the windows were barred and the doors were locked from the outside. The daily routine imposed on imperial wet nurses was regulated with military precision. You woke at dawn for prayers, followed by a breakfast designed specifically to optimize milk production. Palace nutritionists had developed detailed meal plans based on their understanding of how different foods affected breast milk quality and quantity. These meals were elaborate and expensive, featuring ingredients imported from across the empire, but they were also mandatory. You ate what you were told to eat when you were told to eat it, whether you liked it or not. Between meals, you spent your time in carefully supervised activities designed to maintain your health and milk production. This included specific exercises believed to improve circulation, breathing techniques thought to enhance milk quality, and even prescribed periods of rest and relaxation. Every aspect of your daily life was optimized for a single purpose: producing the highest quality nutrition for imperial infants. The psychological preparation for your role was perhaps even more invasive than the physical conditioning. Palace officials understood that wet nurses needed to form emotional bonds with the children they fed, but they also needed to accept that these relationships would be temporary and ultimately meaningless. You were taught to love the imperial infants as if they were your own, while simultaneously accepting that you had no real claim to them and could be dismissed at any moment. This emotional programming was achieved through a combination of religious instruction and psychological manipulation. Palace imams explained that serving as an imperial wet nurse was a sacred duty blessed by Allah himself. You were told that your milk was literally helping to create future caliphs who would spread Islamic rule across the world. This religious framework was designed to make you feel honored by your sacrifice rather than victimized by it. At the same time, you were constantly reminded of your expendability. Other wet nurses who had displeased palace officials were pointed out as cautionary tales. Their fates, dismissal, exile, or worse, served as constant reminders that your privileged position depended entirely on perfect compliance with imperial expectations. You learned to smile when you felt like crying, to express gratitude when you felt resentful, and to suppress any maternal instincts that might conflict with your assigned role. The actual process of imperial breastfeeding was unlike anything practiced in ordinary Ottoman households. When a royal infant was born, multiple wet nurses were assigned to ensure constant availability of milk. This wasn't just about convenience. It was about creating redundancy in case any individual nurse became unavailable through illness, dismissal, or death. The scheduling system for royal feedings was extraordinarily complex, designed to optimize infant nutrition while preventing any single wet nurse from developing too strong a bond with a particular child. You might feed Prince Ahmed in the morning, Princess Mirma in the afternoon, and Prince Selim in the evening. This rotation system ensured that royal children received consistent nutrition, while preventing the formation of exclusive relationships that might threaten imperial control. Each feeding session was supervised by palace officials who monitored everything from the infant's appetite to your emotional responses. These supervisors took detailed notes about feeding duration, the child's behavior, and any signs of special affection between nurse and infant. Too much attachment was considered dangerous. It suggested divided loyalties that could potentially be exploited by palace enemies. The medical theories underlying these practices were fascinatingly wrong by modern standards, but were taken seriously by Ottoman physicians. Palace doctors believed that breast milk quality varied not just based on diet and health, but according to the wet nurse's emotional state, moral character, and even astrological influences. This meant that your moods were constantly monitored and regulated through a combination of medication, dietary adjustments, and psychological manipulation. If you seemed too sad, you might be given special foods believed to elevate mood. If you appeared too attached to a particular infant, you could be reassigned or given treatments designed to reduce emotional bonding. If palace astrologers determined that celestial influences were affecting your milk quality, your feeding schedule might be adjusted to align with supposedly favorable planetary positions. The segregation system within the imperial nursery was another layer of complexity that governed your daily existence. Royal children were separated not just by age and gender, but by their position in the succession hierarchy. Future sultans received different treatment than their siblings, and wet nurses assigned to potential heirs were held to even higher standards than those feeding less important children. This hierarchical system created intense competition among wet nurses, as assignment to a future sultan represented the highest possible honor and came with additional privileges. But it also meant additional scrutiny, more restrictive rules, and greater punishment for any perceived failures. The wet nurse of a future sultan might receive better quarters and more elaborate meals, but she also faced execution if the child died under her care, regardless of whether she was actually responsible. The cultural significance of wet nursing in Ottoman society extended far beyond simple nutrition. In a world where royal bloodlines were considered sacred, the women who provided the first sustenance to future rulers occupied a uniquely important position. Your milk was literally helping to build the bodies that would one day command armies, rule provinces, and shape the destiny of millions. This understanding of your role's importance was both empowering and terrifying. On one hand, you were contributing to the continuation of a dynasty that had conquered Constantinople, defeated the Byzantine Empire, and built one of history's greatest civilizations. On the other hand, the weight of this responsibility was crushing, especially when combined with the constant threat of punishment for any perceived failure. The isolation imposed on imperial wet nurses was designed to prevent contamination, not just physical contamination that might affect milk quality, but social and political contamination that might compromise loyalty to the imperial family. You were cut off from news of the outside world, prevented from maintaining relationships with family and friends, and forbidden from discussing your experiences with anyone outside the palace. This isolation created a strange form of suspended animation, where your entire existence revolved around the needs of children who weren't yours, in service of a system that valued you only for your biological functions. You lived in luxury but without freedom, surrounded by beauty but trapped by circumstances, honored for your service but treated as replaceable property. The psychological effects of this lifestyle were profound and rarely acknowledged by palace officials who designed the system. Many wet nurses developed what we might now recognize as forms of depression, anxiety, and dissociative disorders as they struggled to reconcile their maternal instincts with the artificial constraints of their roles. The medical interventions imposed on imperial wet nurses went far beyond simple health maintenance. They represented a systematic attempt to control and optimize every aspect of your biological function. Palace physicians had developed elaborate theories about how different treatments could enhance milk production, alter its nutritional content, and even influence the character traits that would supposedly be transmitted to nursing infants. Your body became a laboratory for these experiments. Palace doctors administered daily doses of herbal concoctions designed to increase milk flow. These mixtures often contained ingredients that were both expensive and potentially dangerous: powdered pearls for supposed purity, ground rhinoceros horn for strength, rare spices from distant provinces for flavor enhancement. You had no choice but to consume whatever was prescribed, regardless of how it made you feel or what side effects you experienced. The bathing rituals imposed on wet nurses were equally invasive and supposedly scientific. You were required to bathe in water infused with specific herbs and oils that palace physicians believed would improve milk quality. These baths took place in special chambers designed for the purpose, with attendants who scrubbed your skin with imported soaps and applied oils that were meant to keep your breasts in optimal condition for nursing. But perhaps most disturbing were the regular medical examinations that continued throughout your service. Palace physicians would inspect your breasts for any changes in size, shape, or milk production. They would taste your milk to assess its quality and make adjustments to your diet or medication accordingly. These examinations were conducted with the same clinical detachment used for livestock, with detailed records kept of every aspect of your biological function. The emotional manipulation tactics used to maintain control over wet nurses were sophisticated and psychologically devastating. Palace officials understood that women separated from their own children would naturally experience grief and longing. Rather than acknowledging these feelings as normal human responses, they reframed them as character defects that needed to be corrected through various forms of conditioning. You were taught that missing your own child was a sign of insufficient devotion to the imperial family. Crying for your lost baby was treated as evidence of weak faith in Allah's plan. Any expression of sadness or resentment was met with religious instruction designed to make you feel guilty for having such feelings. Palace imams would explain that your sacrifice was necessary for the greater good of the empire, and that questioning it demonstrated spiritual inadequacy. This psychological conditioning was reinforced through a reward system that provided small privileges for perfect compliance, while threatening severe punishment for any sign of rebellion. A wet nurse who showed proper enthusiasm for her duties might receive an extra portion of food, a small piece of jewelry, or permission to spend time in the palace gardens. But any hint of dissatisfaction could result in reduced rations, confinement to quarters, or reassignment to less desirable positions within the palace hierarchy. The competition fostered among wet nurses was another tool of control that prevented solidarity and mutual support. Palace officials deliberately created situations where nurses competed for the honor of feeding particular children or for assignment to higher status infants. This competition was presented as healthy rivalry that would improve performance, but its real purpose was to prevent wet nurses from forming alliances that might challenge palace authority. You might find yourself competing with other women for the privilege of nursing a particularly important prince, knowing that success would bring better treatment, while failure could mean dismissal or worse. This system turned potential allies into rivals, making it impossible to organize any form of resistance to the conditions you all endured. The isolation was not just physical but social, preventing the formation of relationships that might provide emotional support or practical assistance. The record-keeping system surrounding imperial wet nurses was extraordinarily detailed, revealing the bureaucratic mindset that governed every aspect of palace life. Palace scribes maintained comprehensive files on each nurse, documenting everything from your original village and family background to daily observations about your health, behavior, and milk production. These records were updated constantly and used to make decisions about assignments, treatments, and ultimately your fate within the system. Your file might include notes about your emotional state during feeding sessions, observations about which infant seemed to prefer your milk, and assessments of your potential for long-term service. Palace officials used this information to optimize the wet nursing system, moving nurses between different children based on perceived compatibility and adjusting treatments based on documented results. You became a data point in an elaborate system of human resource management that treated people as interchangeable components in a larger machine. The dietary control exercised over imperial wet nurses was so extreme it bordered on the obsessive. Palace nutritionists had developed theories about how different foods would affect not just milk quantity, but its supposed ability to transmit various character traits to nursing infants. If a prince was considered too timid, his wet nurses might be fed foods believed to promote courage. If a princess seemed too willful, her nurses might receive dietary modifications designed to produce more docile influences. These dietary prescriptions were based on a bizarre mixture of Islamic dietary laws, ancient Greek medical theory, and folk beliefs that had accumulated over centuries. You might be required to eat specific combinations of fruits and vegetables at particular times of day, consume expensive imported spices that were supposed to enhance wisdom, or avoid certain foods that were believed to promote negative traits. The meals were elaborate and costly, but they were also mandatory and inflexible, turning eating into another form of controlled performance rather than personal choice. The seasonal variations in wet nurse treatment revealed how palace officials attempted to optimize the system for different times of year. During summer months, when heat and humidity could affect milk production, you might be moved to cooler quarters within the palace and given special cooling treatments. Winter brought different concerns about maintaining warmth and health, leading to adjustments in clothing, housing, and diet designed to ensure consistent milk production regardless of weather conditions. These seasonal protocols were developed over generations of experience and represented the accumulated wisdom of palace officials who had observed thousands of wet nurses over centuries of imperial rule. But they also demonstrated the extent to which your natural biological rhythms were subordinated to artificial systems designed to maximize your utility to the state. Even the changing of seasons became another variable to be controlled and manipulated in service of imperial needs. The religious dimensions of wet nursing in the Ottoman court added another layer of complexity to your daily existence. Islamic law had specific provisions regarding wet nursing relationships, including rules about which children could be nursed by the same woman and how these relationships affected marriage possibilities in later life. Palace religious authorities had to navigate these traditional requirements while accommodating the practical needs of imperial child-rearing. This meant that your nursing assignments were determined not just by practical considerations like milk production and infant preferences, but by complex religious calculations about family relationships and future marriage prospects. Children who shared the same wet nurse were considered milk siblings under Islamic law, creating relationships that could affect diplomatic marriages decades later. Palace officials had to maintain detailed genealogies of these nursing relationships to ensure that future marriage alliances wouldn't inadvertently violate religious prohibitions. The punishment system for wet nurses who failed to meet expectations was designed to be both severe and instructive to others. Minor infractions might result in reduced food rations or confinement to quarters, but serious failures could lead to physical punishment, permanent disfigurement, or death. The specific punishments were often related to the nature of the offense, creating a grotesque form of poetic justice that served as a warning to other nurses. A wet nurse whose milk was deemed inadequate might have her breasts branded to mark her failure. Thus, one who showed excessive attachment to a particular child might be forced to watch that child being transferred to another nurse. Those suspected of disloyalty faced interrogation techniques designed to extract confessions and identify potential conspirators. The palace courtyard occasionally witnessed public punishments of wet nurses whose failures had been deemed particularly egregious, serving as brutal reminders to others about the consequences of imperfection. The long-term fate of imperial wet nurses varied dramatically depending on their performance, the survival of their charges, and the shifting political winds within the palace. Some nurses who successfully raised future sultans might be rewarded with pensions, comfortable retirement quarters, or even positions of authority over younger nurses. But these success stories were rare, and most wet nurses faced uncertain futures once their milk production declined or their services were no longer needed. Many former wet nurses were simply dismissed from the palace with minimal compensation, left to fend for themselves in a world where their years of imperial service had left them ill-equipped for ordinary life. Others were reassigned to different roles within the palace hierarchy, becoming servants or attendants with lower status and fewer privileges. The unlucky ones faced exile to distant provinces or worse fates that palace records discreetly avoided documenting in detail. The psychological transformation undergone by long-serving wet nurses was profound and often permanent. Years of conditioning designed to suppress maternal instincts while providing care for children who could never truly be yours created lasting emotional damage that affected every subsequent relationship. Former wet nurses often struggled to form normal bonds with their own families, having learned to compartmentalize their emotions and suppress natural affections in service of imperial demands. This psychological conditioning was so thorough that many wet nurses internalized the values of the system that oppressed them, becoming enforcers of the same rigid standards that had governed their own lives. Senior nurses often proved more demanding and cruel to younger women than palace officials themselves, having learned that survival depended on perfect compliance with arbitrary rules and regulations. The hierarchical structure within the wet nursing system created a complex web of relationships that determined every aspect of your daily existence. At the top were the Kalfa, senior wet nurses who had proven themselves over years of service and now supervised younger women. These veterans held absolute authority over newer nurses, wielding power with the cruel efficiency of those who had survived the system's worst abuses. They knew every rule, every expectation, every way to avoid punishment, and they guarded this knowledge jealously. Below the Kalfa were the experienced nurses, women who had successfully fed multiple royal children and earned a measure of trust from palace officials. These nurses occupied a precarious middle ground, elevated above newcomers but still vulnerable to dismissal or punishment if they failed to maintain their performance standards. They understood that their position depended entirely on continued success, creating a constant state of anxiety about their next assignment and its potential outcomes. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the new arrivals, women like yourself who had just been torn from their previous lives and thrust into an incomprehensible world of marble corridors and golden cages. These newcomers faced the steepest learning curve, expected to master complex protocols while grieving the loss of their own children, and adapting to the artificial environment of the imperial nursery. Mistakes that might be overlooked in experienced nurses could result in severe punishment for newcomers still learning the intricate rules of palace life. The training process for new wet nurses was deliberately overwhelming, designed to break down your previous identity and rebuild you according to palace specifications. Senior nurses would demonstrate proper feeding positions, showing you how to hold royal infants to maximize their comfort while minimizing your own. These positions were often uncomfortable and unnatural, requiring you to contort your body in ways that prioritize the child's needs over your physical well-being. You learned the elaborate etiquette surrounding each feeding session, how to approach the infant's quarters, which prayers to recite before beginning, how to position yourself in relation to supervising officials, and what facial expressions were considered appropriate during different phases of the nursing process. Every gesture was codified, every moment choreographed according to protocols developed over centuries of imperial tradition. The language used within the wet nursing quarters was itself a form of control, with specific terms and phrases that reinforced your subordinate status, while emphasizing the sacred nature of your duties. You learned to refer to the royal children as little sons or precious jewels, never using their actual names unless specifically instructed. Your own body parts were discussed only in clinical terms that stripped away any sense of personal ownership or intimate connection. This linguistic conditioning extended to how you were expected to speak about your own experiences and feelings. Expressions of homesickness became temporary spiritual weakness. Missing your own child was insufficient gratitude for imperial blessings. Physical discomfort from the demanding schedule was lack of proper dedication to sacred duties. The vocabulary itself became a prison that made it impossible to articulate your true experiences without simultaneously condemning yourself. The surveillance system monitoring wet nurses was more sophisticated than anything you could have imagined. Palace officials understood that controlling behavior required constant observation, and they had developed elaborate networks of informants and observers who reported on every aspect of your daily life. Other wet nurses might be rewarded for reporting suspicious conversations or concerning behavior. Servants who cleaned your quarters were trained to notice and report any signs of discontent or resistance. Even your sleep was monitored, with guards who conducted regular nighttime inspections to ensure you weren't engaging in forbidden activities or attempting unauthorized communication with other palace inhabitants. Your dreams themselves became suspect if you talked in your sleep, as observers tried to interpret unconscious utterances for signs of disloyalty or dangerous thoughts. The constant awareness of being watched created a paranoid atmosphere where genuine human connection became nearly impossible. The medical experimentation conducted on wet nurses went far beyond attempts to optimize milk production. Palace physicians used nursing women as test subjects for various theories about human biology and reproduction. They might expose you to different environmental conditions to study their effects on lactation, or administer experimental substances to observe their impact on milk composition. These experiments were conducted without your consent or even your knowledge, disguised as standard medical care. The results of these experiments were carefully documented and used to refine the wet nursing system over time. Palace physicians maintained detailed records comparing the outcomes of different treatments, tracking which interventions produced the healthiest infants and which resulted in complications or failures. You became part of a vast database of human experimentation that spanned generations of imperial rule, your body contributing data points to theories that treated people as laboratory specimens. The seasonal rhythms of palace life affected wet nurses in ways that revealed the artificial nature of your existence. Natural biological cycles that might normally influence lactation were overridden by medical interventions designed to maintain consistent milk production regardless of environmental factors. Palace physicians administered hormonal treatments during times when milk production might naturally decline, forcing your body to continue functioning according to imperial schedules rather than natural rhythms. These interventions often had severe side effects that were ignored as long as milk production remained adequate. You might experience mood swings, physical pain, or digestive problems as a result of the substances you were forced to consume. But these symptoms were considered acceptable costs of maintaining your usefulness to the imperial family. Your well-being mattered only insofar as it affected your ability to feed royal children. The cultural ceremonies surrounding wet nursing revealed how the Ottoman court attempted to sanctify what was essentially systematic exploitation. Special religious observances were conducted when new nurses arrived at the palace, with imams offering prayers of blessing and gratitude for the sacred service you were about to provide. These ceremonies were designed to make you feel honored rather than enslaved, chosen by divine providence rather than selected by human traffickers. The rituals continued throughout your service, with regular blessings and prayers that reinforced the religious significance of your role while obscuring its exploitative nature. Palace religious authorities developed elaborate theological justifications for the wet nursing system, explaining how your sacrifice contributed to the divine mission of the Ottoman Empire and the spread of Islamic civilization across the world. The psychological manipulation techniques used to maintain compliance became increasingly sophisticated as palace officials refined their understanding of human behavior. They learned to identify the specific emotional vulnerabilities of individual nurses and exploit them through targeted interventions. A woman who showed excessive grief for her lost child might be given small tokens supposedly from that child, creating false hope that maintained her emotional investment in palace service. Those who demonstrated rebellious tendencies might be subjected to treatments designed to modify their behavior through a combination of medical intervention and psychological conditioning. Palace physicians administered substances they believed could alter personality traits, while religious authorities provided counseling designed to redirect dangerous thoughts toward acceptable channels. The goal was not just compliance, but genuine enthusiasm for the role you had been forced to accept. The economic dimensions of the wet nursing system revealed how human lives were reduced to financial calculations in the imperial bureaucracy. Palace accountants maintained detailed records of the costs associated with each nurse, tracking expenses for food, housing, medical care, and supervision against the perceived benefits of the service provided. These calculations determined everything from your daily rations to the medical treatments you received. Nurses who proved expensive to maintain relative to their productivity might find their conditions gradually worsened as palace officials sought to reduce costs. Those who demonstrated exceptional value might receive marginal improvements in treatment, but always within the context of optimizing return on investment rather than recognizing human dignity. The empire's approach to wet nursing was fundamentally commercial, treating women as capital assets to be managed for maximum efficiency. The technological innovations developed specifically for the imperial nursery demonstrated the resources devoted to optimizing royal childcare while maintaining control over the women who provided it. Palace craftsmen created specialized furniture designed to position wet nurses for optimal feeding, while allowing supervisors to observe every detail of the process. These devices were marvels of engineering that prioritized surveillance and control over comfort or natural interaction. Special clothing was designed with hidden fasteners and built-in restraints that could be activated if a nurse showed signs of excessive attachment to a particular child. Feeding chambers were equipped with one-way viewing panels that allowed officials to observe nursing sessions without being seen, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance that made genuine maternal bonding nearly impossible. The record-keeping systems surrounding wet nurses included detailed psychological profiles that tracked emotional responses, behavioral patterns, and what palace officials believed were character assessments. These files followed you throughout your service and determined your assignments, treatments, and ultimate fate within the palace hierarchy. A single negative notation in your file could result in demotion, punishment, or dismissal, creating enormous pressure to maintain perfect compliance with arbitrary standards. The files also included predictions about your long-term reliability and potential for advancement within the system. Palace officials use these assessments to make strategic decisions about resource allocation, training investments, and succession planning for senior positions. Your entire identity was reduced to data points that facilitated administrative efficiency while erasing any recognition of your humanity or individual worth. The international dimensions of the wet nursing system revealed how the Ottoman Empire used human trafficking to staff its most intimate governmental functions. Agents throughout the empire and beyond identified potential candidates and arranged for their acquisition through various means ranging from purchase to kidnapping. This network operated with the same efficiency used to acquire other luxury goods for the imperial court. The geographic diversity of wet nurses was seen as a strength that provided different qualities and characteristics to royal children through their milk. Palace officials maintained elaborate theories about how women from different regions would contribute unique traits to the infants they fed, leading to strategic selection processes that treated human beings as ingredients in a recipe for creating ideal rulers. The legacy system that emerged from centuries of Ottoman wet nursing practices created psychological trauma that extended far beyond the palace walls. Former wet nurses who somehow managed to return to their original communities often found themselves unable to reintegrate into normal family life. Years of conditioning designed to suppress natural maternal instincts while providing artificial care had fundamentally altered their capacity for genuine emotional connection. These women carried invisible scars that manifested in their relationships with their own surviving children, if any still remained. The artificial nature of palace motherhood had taught them to compartmentalize affection, to provide physical care without emotional investment, and to view children as temporary assignments rather than permanent bonds. Many former wet nurses reported feeling like strangers in their own families, unable to bridge the psychological distance that palace conditioning had created. The ripple effects extended through generations as the children of former wet nurses grew up with mothers who had been systematically trained to suppress the very instincts that make parenting natural and intuitive. These families struggled with patterns of emotional distance and difficulty forming secure attachments that could be traced directly back to the imperial wet nursing system's psychological manipulation techniques. The medical legacy of Ottoman wet nursing practices influenced child-rearing theories throughout the Islamic world for centuries after the empire's decline. The elaborate dietary protocols, the scheduling systems, and the surveillance methods developed in the imperial nursery were adapted by wealthy families who sought to emulate royal child-rearing practices without understanding their exploitative foundations. Palace physicians published treatises on optimal wet nursing techniques that circulated throughout the Islamic world, spreading the Ottoman system's pseudo-scientific theories about milk quality, character transmission, and biological optimization. These medical texts treated the systematic abuse of nursing women as cutting-edge science, legitimizing exploitation through academic authority and religious justification. The architectural legacy of the wet nursing system can still be observed in the ruins of Topkapı Palace, where the specialized chambers designed for nursing supervision remain as silent testimony to the systematic control exercised over women's bodies. The viewing panels, the positioning devices, and the isolation chambers tell a story that tourist guides rarely acknowledge. The story of how imperial grandeur was built on foundations of human suffering. The bureaucratic innovations developed to manage wet nurses influenced Ottoman administrative practices in other areas of government. The detailed record-keeping systems, the hierarchical management structures, and the surveillance techniques pioneered in the imperial nursery were adapted for use in managing other groups of palace servants, military units, and provincial administrators. This systematic approach to human resource management became a hallmark of Ottoman administrative efficiency, but it was fundamentally based on treating people as interchangeable components in a larger machine rather than as individuals with inherent dignity and rights. The wet nursing system served as a laboratory for developing techniques of control that were later applied throughout the empire's vast bureaucracy. The religious interpretations developed to justify the wet nursing system had lasting impacts on Islamic legal theory regarding women's bodies and reproductive autonomy. Palace religious authorities created elaborate theological frameworks that portrayed the systematic exploitation of nursing women as divinely ordained service to the Islamic community. These interpretations influenced subsequent generations of Islamic scholars and legal authorities, creating precedents that were used to justify various forms of reproductive control and bodily exploitation long after the Ottoman Empire's collapse. The theological legacy of the wet nursing system contributed to religious traditions that prioritized community needs over individual autonomy in matters of reproduction and child-rearing. The psychological techniques developed for conditioning wet nurses were remarkably sophisticated for their era, incorporating methods that wouldn't be formally recognized by psychology until centuries later. Palace officials intuitively understood principles of behavioral modification, emotional manipulation, and identity reconstruction that modern psychologists would classify as systematic psychological abuse. These techniques were refined through generations of experience with thousands of women, creating a body of practical knowledge about human psychological vulnerability that was both impressive and deeply disturbing. The Ottoman wet nursing system essentially conducted large-scale experiments in psychological control that contributed to understanding human behavior while causing immeasurable suffering. To the women subjected to these methods, the economic calculations underlying the wet nursing system revealed the extent to which human lives were reduced to mathematical equations in the imperial bureaucracy. Palace accountants developed sophisticated models for calculating the optimal number of wet nurses needed to ensure adequate coverage while minimizing costs, treating women's lives as variables in efficiency equations. These calculations included projections for replacement rates based on mortality, dismissal, and natural decline in milk production, creating actuarial tables that predicted human suffering with the same precision used for inventory management. The empire's approach to wet nursing was fundamentally industrial, applying mass production principles to the most intimate aspects of childcare. The international intelligence networks that supported wet nurse acquisition operated with the same sophistication used for military espionage and diplomatic intelligence. Ottoman agents throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa maintained detailed databases of potential candidates, tracking demographic trends and political instabilities that might create opportunities for acquiring suitable women. These networks included corrupt local officials who could facilitate acquisitions, merchants who could transport human cargo, and palace contacts who could arrange documentation and integration into the imperial system. The wet nursing program essentially operated as a parallel government focused entirely on human trafficking for reproductive purposes. The technological innovations developed for the imperial nursery included some of the most sophisticated surveillance and control devices of their era. Palace engineers designed mechanical systems for monitoring nursing sessions, recording devices for capturing conversations, and restraint mechanisms that could be activated remotely if nurses showed signs of resistance or excessive attachment. These innovations represented significant investments in technology specifically designed to dehumanize the nursing process while maximizing administrative control. The imperial nursery became a showcase for cutting-edge techniques of human management that prioritized efficiency and surveillance over natural maternal bonding and child development. The cultural impact of the wet nursing system extended throughout Ottoman society as families attempted to emulate imperial child-rearing practices. Wealthy merchants and provincial governors established their own versions of the palace system, creating a cascade of exploitation that affected thousands of women beyond those directly serving the imperial family. This cultural emulation spread the psychological and social damage of the wet nursing system throughout Ottoman society, normalizing the treatment of women as reproductive resources rather than autonomous individuals. The imperial model became the standard for elite child-rearing practices, legitimizing exploitation through association with royal tradition and religious authority. The documentation system surrounding wet nurses created one of history's most comprehensive databases of systematic human rights violations, though the perpetrators saw it as evidence of administrative sophistication rather than criminal activity. These records provide modern historians with detailed insights into the mechanics of systematic exploitation, while serving as testimony to the suffering of thousands of unnamed women. The preservation of these records in Ottoman archives means that the stories of wet nurses remain accessible to researchers, offering opportunities for historical accountability and remembrance that are rare for exploited populations in pre-modern societies. The bureaucratic obsession with documentation that facilitated the abuse also ensured that evidence of the abuse would survive for future generations to study and condemn. The medical experimentation conducted on wet nurses contributed to advances in understanding lactation and infant nutrition, but this knowledge came at the cost of treating women as laboratory subjects without consent. Palace physicians developed techniques for optimizing milk production and infant health that were genuinely innovative, but they were achieved through systematic violation of human dignity and bodily autonomy. This medical legacy raises profound ethical questions about the relationship between scientific advancement and human rights, illustrating how legitimate research objectives can be pursued through illegitimate means. The knowledge gained from studying wet nurses was built on a foundation of exploitation that taints any beneficial outcomes achieved through these practices. The story of Ottoman wet nursing ultimately serves as a cautionary tale about how systems of power can transform natural human relationships into mechanisms of control and exploitation. The imperial nursery, presented as the pinnacle of sophisticated childcare, was actually a sophisticated machine for breaking women's spirits while extracting their biological resources for state purposes. Behind the marble facades and golden decorations of Topkapı Palace lay a system of systematic abuse that treated women as living tools rather than human beings with inherent dignity and rights. The wet nurses who fed future sultans paid an enormous price for imperial grandeur, sacrificing their own children, their freedom, their health, and often their sanity in service to a system that viewed them as expendable resources. Their stories remind us that the magnificent civilizations we admire in history books were often built on foundations of human suffering that official histories prefer to ignore. The Ottoman Empire's achievements in architecture, literature, military conquest, and administrative innovation were real and impressive. But they came at a cost that included the systematic exploitation of vulnerable women who had no choice in their fate. As you walk through the preserved chambers of Topkapı Palace today, remember the ghosts of those wet nurses who once moved through these corridors, carrying children who were never truly theirs. Their sacrifice helped build an empire, but their humanity was sacrificed in the process. In remembering their stories, we honor not only their individual suffering, but also our collective responsibility to recognize and prevent such systematic exploitation wherever it occurs. The echoes of their cries still whisper through those marble halls, reminding us that behind every tale of imperial glory lies the untold story of those who paid the price for others' power and privilege.